In 1968, the Beatles didn't just record a song, they recorded the sound of an ideal collapsing. One track would haunt Paul McCartney for the next 40 years. Yet when fans unwrapped the stark all-white sleeve of the White Album in November 1968, they expected comfort. Classic Beatles, clean melodies, peaceful songs about love and unity. It was the final gasp of the hippie dream, and that's what the world wanted to hear. But right after the gentle sway of Sexy Sadie, something went wrong. 4 seconds of silence, then impact. A sudden, brutal wall of sound. While the Flower Power era still clung to life outside the studio, inside Abbey Road, the Beatles were quietly, definitively ending the 1960s. What followed would be blamed on ego, rivalry, and coincidence, a chain of events that would later be written in blood on a refrigerator in California. Today, we're talking about the day the Beatles, consciously or not, murdered the ideal of the 60s. It began in 1967 with Paul McCartney at home, wrestling with a problem he could no longer ignore. He was tired of being the nice one. Beside him stood Lennon, the rebellious genius, Harrison, the mystic seeker, and Ringo, the engine who kept everything moving. Paul was the polite Beatle, the safe Beatle, and it was driving him mad. One morning, he stumbled across an interview with Pete Townshend, guitarist of The Who, boasting that their latest single was the dirtiest, loudest song ever recorded. Townshend talked about a cursed guitar, a swearing cymbal. Paul hadn't even heard it yet, but the insult landed anyway. To him, this was territory, a line in the sand. He decided instantly he would make a record so ferocious it would make The Who sound like a choir of choir boys. It wasn't until the spring of 1968, just after returning from India, that Paul finally sat down to write. He dusted off the challenge and scribbled the first lines of his answer, Helter Skelter. In England, the phrase meant a spiral slide at a fairground, something innocent and childlike, but McCartney twisted it into something darker, a metaphor for a fall you can't climb back from. By September 1968, the Beatles were ready to unleash it. Inside Abbey Road's Studio 2, they embarked on one of the wildest sessions of their career. George Martin was on holiday, leaving the controls to his 21-year-old assistant, Chris Thomas. Martin was usually the craftsman, the one who shaped chaos into form. This time, the assistant was terrified. Alone with 4 men who had decided to become barbarians, he watched as the studio filled with tension, volume, and excess. They weren't running on coffee. Fueled by weed and cocaine to survive all-night sessions, the band pushed themselves past exhaustion. Paul's objective was brutally simple. He wasn't chasing beauty, he was chasing noise. And once the tape started rolling, there was no turning back. This wasn't about melody anymore. It was about finding the edge and jumping off it. What poured out of the speakers that night didn't sound like classic rock. It sounded ugly, dangerous, almost wrong. Paul pushed the amps so hard the tubes glowed red hot, and inside the control booth, the needles were buried deep in the red. The recording was a mess, and that was the point. Chaos ruled the room. George Harrison set an ashtray on fire, balanced it on his head, and ran around the studio mocking Arthur Brown, the shock rocker famous for wearing a flaming helmet during fire. That should tell you everything about the atmosphere: exhaustion, hysteria, and total loss of control. John Lennon, who almost never touched a bass, grabbed a Fender VI and attacked it like a weapon. He didn't know how to play it. He smashed the strings, drifted out of tune, and somehow it was perfect. The band ran themselves into the ground, recording take after take, including one version that stretched on for 27 relentless minutes. Finally, at the end of the 21st take, the sound simply collapsed. Ringo snapped. He hurled his drumsticks against the wall and screamed. His hands, once unscathed, were shredded, the skin torn from pounding the drums hard enough to fight through the guitar noise. But they had it. Helter Skelter was born. And without realizing it, the Beatles had just laid the groundwork for heavy metal. Years later, legends like Lemmy of Motorhead and Tony Iommi of Black Sabbath would point back to the Beatles as a foundational influence. Then came November 22nd, 1968. The White Album hit the shelves. Another flop, as usual, swallowed instantly by millions. But among those listeners was one man who heard something else entirely. Out in California, on a dusty ranch used as a backdrop for old westerns, lived Charles Manson and what he called his family. At the time, Manson wasn't yet a symbol of pure evil. He was a petty manipulator, freshly released from prison, gathering lost and broken kids around him. One crucial detail matters here. Manson was a failed musician. Fame obsessed him. He believed the world owed him success. He'd chased the dream, even crashing at the Beach Boys' drummer's house, and been rejected every time. His ego was bruised, his resentment boiling. In his mind, he deserved to be as big as the Beatles. What he needed was a sign, proof that he was the Messiah he claimed to be. When the White Album finally arrived at the ranch, the heat was unbearable. Everyone was high as Manson dropped the needle onto the vinyl. To him, this wasn't music, it was prophecy.
I don't know what I thought when it happened. I just think a lot of the things he says are true. That he's a child of the state, made by us, in a light-hearted way that some intellectual would read as some symbolic youth generation. I mean, I don't know, what's Helter Skelter got to do with knifing someone?
He became convinced the Beatles were the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and that buried in their songs was a coded message meant for him alone, calling for the spark that would ignite a race war.
Once the door to madness opened, everything became evidence. Every lyric was twisted, every song became proof. In Charles Manson's mind, the White Album wasn't music, it was scripture. Blackbird became a call to arms for Black Americans. Piggies was reimagined as a hit list targeting the white elite. And Helter Skelter wasn't just a song anymore, it was the code name for his apocalypse. In August 1969, Manson finally acted. He ordered what he called his family to carry out unspeakable murders. Sharon Tate and later the LaBiancas. You already know the details, and we won't dwell on them here, but one chilling link ties it all together. On a refrigerator door at the crime scene, written in blood, was a single word, the song title, misspelled, Skelter. For Paul McCartney, the impact was devastating. What began as a simple artistic challenge ended with his name forever associated with one of the most infamous crimes of the 20th century. A song meant to push boundaries had collided with real-world horror. So what do we take from all this? Musically, McCartney won. He proved he could be the king of pop and still unleash something violent and aggressive. That opened the door for the bands that followed, Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and countless others. If the Beatles could saturate sound to the breaking point, then anyone could. But the deeper truth is what this says about the era itself. We like to remember the 1960s as peace and love, but outside that fantasy was chaos, Vietnam, riots, political paranoia, assassinations. The counterculture was a bubble, desperately pretending none of it existed. Manson didn't appear out of nowhere. He was a product of that moment. A man who had spent half his life in prison, who understood real violence, stepping into a world of unchecked freedom and seeing weakness instead of harmony. Helter Skelter means disorder, confusion. And that's where Paul McCartney's idea truly lands. For Paul, it was always a metaphor, a descent you can't climb back from. And with that song, the Beatles didn't just change music once again, they collided head-on with history. Helter Skelter didn't end the dream of the 60s, it acknowledged that the dream was already dead and that there was no going back. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, comment, and share. It's what keeps the channel alive. We'll see you soon in the next video.